was a massacre, which obviously speaks volumes about the deep seated hatred and neglect that the Shias of Kurram, people of Parachinar, face.
Hello, you've tuned into State of South Asia, a podcast from Himal Southasian, where we have the best minds on the region to unpack crucial issues affecting our politics, cultures, environments, and societies. I'm your host, Naintara Narayanan, coming to you from Bangalore. On November 21st, 103 Shia Muslims, including 17 children, were killed when they came under brutal attack in Parachinar, a Shia majority area in Pakistan's Khyber Pakhtunkhwa province, close to the border with Afghanistan. This attack was one in a long history of sectarian violence between the country's Sunnis, who are the majority, and the Shia minority that has been increasingly persecuted and targeted. The nature of the conflict has also changed over the decades from a fight over resources to a deeper divide over ideology. Sana Batool joins us on the podcast from Falmouth University in the United Kingdom to tell us more. Sana is a writer, journalist, and researcher currently working on a PhD on media and the marginalization of minority groups. We're recording this episode on the 12th of December. Sana, thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me. Thanks a lot.
So, before we jump into the discussion, here's a quick reminder to all our listeners that you can become a paying patron of Himal South Asian to help us in our mission to show you South Asia like no one else can. Visit our website, himalmag.com, and click on Support Himal. Now, on to the discussion about violence against Shia Muslims in Pakistan. Sana, you've written a piece for Himal that is up on our website about what happened on November 21st. Can you take our listeners through the events of that day again and how the story came to your attention?
So that day was truly horrific, and a convoy of 100 vehicles carrying Shia Muslims was traveling from Parachinar to Peshawar, and there was another one which was coming from Peshawar to Parachinar. And we heard that it was ambushed at the Tal Parachinar Road. And this highway is not just a road, but it's a lifeline for the people of Parachinar because it's a route that connects them to the rest of the country. So, for things like medical care, education, or business activities. But it has become a death trap for a Shia community because it runs through the areas where there is presence of extremist Sunni groups and where sectarian tensions often erupt into violence. Even before this incident, a few days before this incident, a Qatari-based businessman who is from Parachinar, he was returning to his hometown and his car was attacked near Bagan area, where there is a presence of extremist Sunni militant groups, and he was killed brutally. What's more concerning is if we talk about the November 21st attack on the vehicles and on the convoy, is that these vehicles were under security escort and yet they were attacked in multiple locations. So the people I talked to for this story told me that the militants were present there in those areas and they opened fire with guns, heavy ammunitions were used in the attack. And the survivors that I spoke to, they said that there was an absolute chaos. People were hiding under seats or, running for their lives. Some hid themselves in the bushes and the bullets were raining down. And one of the teenagers that I spoke to said that the gunfire lasted for over an hour. So far, as we speak on 12th of December, the death toll has risen to 130 people, and those also include, women and children. And what's more concerning is that it wasn't a random violence; it was pre-planned. The people told me that there were even reports of the announcements from the mosques in the Sunni majority areas calling for the killings of Shias. And so it wasn't just an ambush, it was a massacre, and which obviously speaks volumes about the deep seated hatred and neglect that, the Shias of Kurram, people of Parachinar, face. And here I would also like to include that a day after the attack, some Shias from Parachinar attacked the area where the convoy was attacked, and set houses and shops on fire. And there were some casualties also reported. So the reason, that they give is that the security forces never come to help. And so they have sort of, taken the matters in their own hands.
Yeah, so, just to understand the lay of the land here, again, in your piece for Himal, you describe the almost siege like conditions under which Shias in Kurram and Parachinar are living. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Yeah, so in terms of, where this Kurram is situated and what's the region is like. So Kurram is in the northwest of Pakistan, and Parachinar is one of its towns, which is in the north of Kurram. That also is a bordering town, you could say, from of Afghanistan. And it's incredibly strategic geographically, but that also makes it really volatile region. The area is mountainous, it's rugged and hard to access, which has historically, made it easy to isolate. So the main road, the Tal Parachinar Highway, is the only connection that connects Parachinar to the outside world. So for the Shia population in Parachinar, this road is like a lifeline, like I say, but it has become a nightmare for them,
Right.
and they rely on it for everything, for medical care, for education, for economic activities. But the Sunni militant groups frequently block it, essentially, just putting everything under siege. And during these blockades that have been happening in the past decade, it's the basic supplies like food and medicine that become scarce. Even at the moment, the Parjanar has been under siege since 66 days, and the residents are left to basically fend for themselves. And it's like in a constant state of emergency. And that isolation, I feel, makes the people of Parjanar incredibly vulnerable also, as we saw, the November 21st attack then happened.
If we can discuss the dynamics of the communities living in this area now, Pashtuns, many of them live in the Khyber Pakhtunkhwa area, have long complained about violence against them because they have been caught in this so called war of terror between the Pakistani state and groups like the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan or TTP. Just last month, I spoke to a Himal contributor, Hurmat Ali Shah, on this podcast about how for decades Pashtuns have borne the brunt of the violence resulting from the Pakistan state's very volatile relationship with militant groups. And that includes killings and enforced disappearances. And yet, within the province, you have this dynamic between the Sunnis and the Shias. So, how does the Sunni Pashtun majority regard the Shia community? And does it include the Shias in their call for enforcing human rights?
Well, this is a tough one though, because on the surface, I mean, if we talk about the Pashtun culture, it really emphasizes, unity. It's a beautiful culture. And they are also, in some way on the receiving end of violence, if we look at the whole Pashtun community. And if we talk about, Sunni and Shia or the sectarian division, it is not just limited to Kurram, but there are, elements of that all over Pakistan. So we should look at it in that dynamic only. So the Shia community in Kurram, particularly the Turi tribe, has faced hostility from the Sunni Pashtun majority. And historically, also, there have been like disputes over land and resources. But because of the presence of the extremist groups like Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, it has turned into a full blown sectarian violence. So, for Sunni Pashtuns, particularly those influenced by the extremist ideologies in Kurram, and I would say in Kurram particularly, Shias are seen as religiously and culturally different. So this perception has been, fueled by decades of hate speech and propaganda. So while there may be some who don't actively engage in violence in Kurram, the broader atmosphere is one of mistrust and sadly often open hostility towards the Shia community in the Kurram region.
And Sana, so what does that hostility look like? The not these kind of brutal attacks, but the day-to-day mistrust and hostility. What does that look like between the two communities?
There is obviously, like I said, that there have been, there's a lot of occupying of land which belongs to the Turi tribes, and then there is like discrimination, attack on the businesses of the Shia community, and unfortunately, in Parachinar, it has always been very violent. If we look at, the day-to-day hostilities, if we talk about that, so November 21st attack was one incident, but they have been like constant attacks and killings of the Shia community that are often not reported by the media. So the normal day hostility in the Kurram region against the Shias, I would say, is basically the killing of the people and attacks on them.
So, through this year at Himal, we have kept an eye on flashpoints in Pakistan. Our contributor Salman Rafi Sheikh has written about the Baloch separatist movement, its increasing xenophobia and violent targeting of Punjabis, and the state's heavy handedness in the region. He also wrote about the mass protests and seething resentment against Islamabad in Pakistan administered Kashmir. Himal brings you important perspective of conflict wherever it takes place in South Asia, and it takes a lot to do this work. You can support our mission to show you the region like no one else can by becoming a paying patron of the magazine. Click on the link in the episode notes or go to our website himalmag.com and click support Himal. You can also sign up to our newsletters and keep up with our latest stories, events, and more. Now back to our conversation with Sana Batool. Sana, this sectarian conflict between Shias and Sunnis is almost 1400 years old, going back to the Battle of Karbala. But in more recent history, it has been about politics and geopolitics. In the 1970s, it fueled the standoff between Saudi Arabia, with its Sunni majority, and Iran, with its Shia majority, in the backdrop of all this wealth of oil being found in the region. But Pakistan became a proxy in that tussle, and this deepened the divide between Pakistan's own Shias and Sunnis. And this was during the time of Zia ul Haq, the military dictator in Pakistan in the late 1970s and early 80s. Take us a little bit through that history and what happened, how that divide just became deeper and wider.
Yeah, so there is this narrative that you would find in the discourse and also through media, which is that the Shia-Sunni divide happened due after 1979 revolution of Iran, which is true. I mean, but I would say that it had only intensified during that time because if we go back to 1963, for example, there have been similar attacks as November 21st, even in 1963 when obviously the geopolitical situation was not around Iran or Saudi Arabia. There's an incident that it was reported but framed differently, and it was reported as a sectarian clash between the Shia Sunni in the Sindh Khairpur Thari district, and where the a Shia procession was attacked and more than 100 people were axed in that incident. But it never came to light the way it deserved. But I would say that during the Ziaul Haq's era, it only intensified. And like you said, that during Ziaul Haq's regime in the 1980s, Pakistan leaned heavily towards Saudi Arabia. And Zia promoted a strict Sunni Islamic ideology, and Saudi Arabia, it poured money into madrasas that taught this version of Islam. And at the same time, Iran was supporting Shia organizations in Pakistan, like Sipahi Muhammad. And this rivalry then polarized, the Sunni and Shia communities further. So, what's even more tragic is that Zia institutionalized this divide, and Sunni militants, the groups were encouraged and sometimes even supported, while Shias were sidelined or actively targeted. So, the legacy of the era, it still haunts Pakistan today as both groups, born out of that period, like Sipahi Sahaba or Sipahi Muhammad or, Lashkar-e-Jhangvi, they continue to, fuel sectarian violence.
Right. And so, is this how earlier disputes between communities. You mentioned like the Turi tribe. Were disputes over resources like land and water, is this how it shifted to this larger ideological rift between the two groups?
Yes, Kurram's conflict didn't always have this sectarian tone, which is true. And I mean, if we look at historically, there were local disputes over things like land, water between the tribes. But over time, extremist groups, reframed these disputes as religious battles. But the turning point came during the Soviet-Afghan War in the 1980s. I mean, with the influx of Afghan refugees and the rise of militant Sunni ideologies, these local disagreements turned into ideological conflicts. So the Shia tribes, like the Turis, they resisted the Taliban use of their land, which made them targets, potential targets. And then groups like, Taliban and Sipah Sahaba started using sectarian narratives to justify their attack. That, if they are Shia, that they deserve to be killed. So it turned Kurram into a flashpoint for religious violence.
Okay, so looking beyond Kurram, looking beyond Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, in 2020, there were rallies in Karachi against Shias, with people raising slogans referring to them as infidels. There have been blasphemy cases filed against Shia Muslims. And so, beyond these kind of terrible physical attacks, like the one we saw in late November in Kurram, what other forms of anti Shia sentiment and action have we seen across Pakistan, not just in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, but across Pakistan in recent years?
Yeah, so like you mentioned that hate speech and systemic discrimination and social marginalization of Shias is not just limited to Kurram. So I mean, hate speech, like I said, then it's very common. Like you mentioned, there are the slogans like Shia Kafir, which means Shias are infidels, and public rallies openly called for violence against them, including the group leaders openly using social media platforms or their rallies to incite violence and incite hatred against the Shia community. And then certain laws also serve as a tool to use which are being used against Shia. So false accusations, for example, can lead to like legal trouble, social ostracism, or even mob violence. And if we talk about economically also, if not just in Kurram, but for example in places like Quetta in Hazara town, where Hazaras are often attacked by the extremist Sunni groups as well. Their businesses are targeted, and they face all sorts of discrimination and marginalization on all levels, all across Pakistan.
Right. But what kind of legal recourse do Shia Muslims have in the country when, trouble like this arises?
Yeah, so legally, Pakistan's constitution it guarantees religious freedom, but we see the reality is very different. So, like sectarian cases are rarely prosecuted effectively, and there is, often bias in the judicial system, and certain laws are particularly, misused against the Shia community. Uh, which makes them more vulnerable to persecution. So, for example, even when Shias try to seek justice for attacks like the one in Kurram or in Hazara, the lack of political will and fear of extremist groups often, means the perpetrators go unpunished. And the system is such that, it offers very little hope for accountability.
Right. In the context of the attack in Kurram, you said, how that attack was so illustrative of the security forces not being able to protect Shia Muslims, about how the whole security system is not very interested in protecting them either. What is the government's attitude? And these are not only this government, but successive governments in Pakistan. What has their attitude towards incidents of anti-Shia violence been?
Yeah, that's really important question. So the government response has been, I would say, disappointing, to say the least. So we have also seen that, in the past, like you mentioned, that, for example, in 2020, when Hazara Shia coal miners were beheaded and their families refused to bury the dead and demanded justice from then Prime Minister Imran Khan and asked him to visit them. To which I remember Imran Khan had said that they can't blackmail me, which is still so fresh in the memories of the Shia community because it was really, it just felt like a stab. And after attacks like the one in Kurram, we heard a lot of like condemnations and promises of justice, but rarely we see that, any action. And it often feels like the state is either complicit or too afraid to take on extremist groups. So there's also a political element. Some extremist groups have ties to the political parties as well, which makes it even harder for the government to crack down on the perpetrators. So for Shias, this inaction, it always feels like a betrayal, and they feel abandoned by the very institution that is supposed to protect them, because it's just the people I spoke to, after the Kurram attack. They said the same, that they had a lot of trust on the security, official security that was provided to the convoy, but they didn't see anybody even firing a single bullet towards the militants when the attack happened. So there is this mistrust also, which has intensified after this incident.
Sana, if I can ask you, we've spoken both about very violent attacks. We've also spoken about the general air of mistrust between the two communities, particularly the way Sunnis perceive Shias. But how would you term the difference between, a Sunni Muslim in Pakistan who is not a violent extremist and these extremist groups who are willing to go out and attack Shia Muslims? Where is that line and how do people cross over? Is there a way that you can illustrate this for our listeners?
Well, if we talk about the majority Sunnis in Pakistan, I think one of the things that also contributes to that is lack of awareness and the context. And it's difficult to actually say, to know about, how people perceive Shias. But what we have seen majorly is a silence towards the anti-Shia violence by the majority Sunnis.
But how would you describe the composition or what kinds of people join these extremist Sunni groups who are willing to attack Shia Muslims?
So, like I said, that a lot of funding came in the establishment of madrasas over the decades. There's this history to it, and I think this has intensified the kind of literature that has been taught in madrasas. So, majorly, the people who have studied in these madrasas have picked up weapons against the Shias. And if we talk about the general Sunni population, they are not directly attacking the Shias, but the bias or the hatred, or in some way indifference towards the Shia community, makes them also, complicit in some way to this violence and marginalization.
And another big factor, again, one that you've pointed out in the piece that you've written for us, is the role of the media. You say that the media has largely been silent about these attacks against Shias. How and why has that happened?
Like there are a few reasons for this silence. I think first there is a fear. Also, journalists covering sectarian violence or difficult, challenging subjects. They risk retaliation from the extremist groups. And secondly, that there is a state pressure as well, and the government, often discourages reporting on these issues to maintain a facade of stability in the country. But there's also a societal aspect to it. The sectarian violence is often seen as a local issue, not something that concerns the broader population. Like I spoke about the indifference, the general indifference towards the anti-Shia violence, and I think this lack of coverage obviously dehumanizes the minority communities, which are the victims, and then perpetuates and allows the violence to continue unchecked.
Right. Is there a difference between how, say, legacy media, mainstream media organizations would cover such an incident, and maybe if there are freelancers who are writing about it, or an independent organization writing about it, is there a difference in the coverage?
Absolutely. I have, I'm myself worked as a freelance journalist and also with a media organization in Pakistan in the newsroom. And I have seen, how a lot of times whenever there were stories about the Shia community, we were asked to remove the word Shia from the story and not frame it or, write it in from the sectarian angle to de-escalate the violence. That, these are the terms that are used in the newsrooms, that they don't want to add to they don't want to frame it as a sectarian issue.
Mm,
Even in, I mean, if you see in the coverage of the Kurram incident, most of the media organizations of Pakistan, they have covered it, but they have covered it from, land dispute perspective or, sectarian clash perspective rather than so they try to create a binary between the two groups. So, yes, of course, I mean, independent media, a lot of Pakistani journalists, when they write for an international media, for the media outside Pakistan, or even the media houses which are based outside Pakistan, they have more flexible, they are more flexible, they are more open, and they try to cover the sectarian angle as well. But if you are a mainstream media in Pakistan, which is obviously under state pressure, so you are not allowed to. It does not. They say that it's not an editorial policy that we cannot use the word Sunni or Shia in the story. So yeah, that's the difference.
right. Sana, I'm finally going to ask you for three recommendations for our listeners to understand the region and the issue better. These, of course, they could be books or movies or even other podcasts. What would you recommend?
So for particularly if obviously the listeners want to read about the Kurram in particular, what the region is like and what are the the historical and social roots of extremism. I would recommend two books. One is The Making of Terrorism in Pakistan by Eamon Murphy. It was published in 2013. And the second one is by Mariam Abu Zahab, which was published in 2020. It's called Pakistan, A Kaleidoscope of Islam. So these are the two books that would give an insight about the northwestern, the tribal regions in Pakistan and their conflicts. And overall, if they want to understand about the Shias in Pakistan, then they should definitely read the incredible work of Andreas Reek. It's called The Shias of Pakistan. So this would be my recommendation.
Thank you so much, Sana, for joining us today and talking about this very important issue. Thanks for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Sana Batool on the State of South Asia podcast. You can read much more from Pakistan on our website himalmag.com, and you'll find these stories in the episode notes. Follow the Himal South Asian podcast channel on your podcast app to find all our latest episodes, and you can share, rate, and review them. You can also catch up with episodes of the South Asia Review of Books podcast with Shweta Srikantan. Don't forget to sign up to our newsletters to keep up with Himal's work. This episode was edited by Ritika Chauhan. We'll be back soon with another in depth conversation on the next episode of State of South Asia with me, Nandara Narayana. Thank you for listening and see you then.